Welcome back to part two of our very excitable series. We are running through each of the categories of fragrances, or at least some major categories of fragrances that we chose. And we have decided to sort of exemplify those categories with individual one fragrance per category. So the last time that you joined us, if you did in fact join us last time, hopefully you will, we went through spicy perfumes, woody, aromatic, citrus, and aquatic perfumes. So today we are building off of that discussion with green, fruity, floral, leathers, and gourmands. And then we have a kooky little part three in the works as well that we'll hint at the end of this video. But we're excited to kind of get right back into it today with green. So without further ado, John, Nicola, either of you want to start us off with the green category?
I think John should, because of his lovely green living room.
Well, I'm going to talk about one now, and then I'm going to quickly mention another after it, just in passing. But I picked a bit of an unusual one that's not going to be as common, but it's such a good green and a standout green to me. This is by a, forgive me if I'm wrong, but this is a French-Canadian perfumer, Monsiage. And she works, I'm not sure which province she works at, but this is Eau De Celeri, which, celery perfume, which I found such an intriguing concept in it. And I believe that it did win an Art and Olfaction Award some years ago. What I really love about this fragrance, it's really artistic. It's very green. It's damn woody. It's very vetiver. But also what I find so curious about it is that, it's pretty tough to make a celery-based fragrance, right? And, or the idea of a kind of celery water, celery-infused fragrance. And she accomplishes this by using other green things around it. So vetiver, galbanum, coriander. There's a little bit of a kind of floral note in here to kind of lift it a little bit up. But it starts out with a very sort of bright green opening, and then it kind of gets into much more rootier and woodier kind of aspects of green. So it sort of looks at that whole green spectrum, which I found to be really interesting. And the fact that it can focus as well on the greener aspect of vetiver as opposed to just the dank, smoky aspects or the grassy aspects of vetiver, I found to be so intriguing. And it's also just an interesting way to interpret something that's an organic, very peculiar smelling green. And it's sort of an interpretation of celery as opposed to an actual sort of photorealistic kind of celery. It's a really beautiful and artistic fragrance, and I really, really like this one. And just in passing, I also wanted to mention, I think what's a classic green that's really important in amongst green perfumes, and also I guess you could say among fougères as well, and that's Penhaligon's English Fern. And this is it's classic fougère, but what's so great about it is that through the fougère structure, with geranium and lavender and whatnot, it becomes this very unbelievably mentholic, bracing green, really like bright green kind of a scent. Absolutely classic green in my mind.
One of the things I'd love to ask you both, knowing that you both know raw materials very well, what raw materials typically say green to you in compositions? Because I know galbanum's the one that often gets bandied around quite often. You mentioned vetiver and coriander there, but what other materials say green?
I can actually quickly tell you a funny story. When I started, studying fragrance making, I made the very big mistake of beginning with green notes, because the majority of the green notes that we use in fragrances are synthetic. And so I had to suddenly learn all these synthetic notes that I had no idea what the heck they did. There are some natural notes that provide that greenness that we know, but I would say the majority of them in fragrances are synthetic. So we would probably, list off things like hexanol cis-3, this or that, like the melon smelling things, or the grassy smelling things, or the cucumbery smelling notes and things like that. And but I would say the one element of the natural palette that says green most to me is probably galbanum, like a very diluted galbanum at like 10%, 5% or something, has a beautiful green tone to it. What I'm surprised by is that some of the notes that one might typically associate, natural notes that one might typically associate with greenness, sometimes don't really translate that way. Something for me like basil as a note is actually a lot more spicy and more complicated in a sense, and more savory than green necessarily. And I'd say the same is true with things like mint and whatnot. That tends to be more of a kind of a bright, almost closer to citrus than would be green.
It's interesting. Basil is one of the things people ask me to recommend fragrances that smell like crushed basil. You say to people, what your fragrance, what's your favorite smell? Basil often comes up, and then they say, oh, can you recommend a fragrance like that? And the only time I've ever found one that came close was really weird. I happened to stop in Genoa just overnight one time, and they had like a citywide fragrance sort of, this scent had been made to perfume the city. And we were walking down the street, and there was a big reed diffuser, and I was like, oh my God, that smells amazing. So we tracked the shop down, and I said to the woman, you're going to do this as a perfume, because that would make a stunning perfume and you would sell a bucket load of it. And she's a bit like, yeah, maybe not. It was beautiful. It was absolutely beautiful. And it was the closest to basil, that crushed basil. You kind of pick it and you bruise it. Oh, just gorgeous.
Yeah, that sounds amazing. Absolutely.
Yeah.
To answer your question, John, I think some of my favorite green materials in perfumery would probably fall along the line of cis-3 hexanol, just because it's not just a green grassy material, but it also can be used to create like fruit and floral accords. Adds to it's sort of like that one material, if you had to choose like a secret material, although I'm sure any perfumer probably wouldn't want to phrase something so generally. If you want to add some sort of outdoorsy or natural quality to something, chances are adding a tiny amount of cis-3 hexanol will do the trick. So it's a really fascinating material. But I also really like something called humus ether, HUMUS ether. It's got this mossy effect, and it's used often in sort of moss replacement accords. So it's a really fascinating material, very earthy, almost clay-like, but kind of damp too. A really incredible material. And so like there are a number of green materials that we could choose from when we're blending something with a green quality to it. But I think some of my favorite green accords typically have something that's also very dewy or a little bit damp, because it's very rare that you go outside and everything is completely dry unless you're in a very hot climate. Usually to communicate green, I think you have to have something that's a little bit, moisture ridden, or at least smells like it's moisture ridden, something kind of dank or damp about it to really communicate greenness. And some of my favorite green accords, again, are really sappy and dewy and rich like that. I think otherwise you kind of run the risk of smelling like hay, like dried grass, which is a beautiful smell in and of itself, and one could argue very green too. But I think green accords are typically a little separate from, hay accords, for example.
Right. On that note, what's your green perfume that you wanted to talk about?
Okay. I have right away an apology to make. Actually, two, I think. First, to the audience, because I've talked about this fragrance before, and second, to John, because I know I don't want to make it, oh, we're friends, so I'm going to talk about something you made. But, I just can't imagine us talking about green fragrances without bringing up Eider Antler. I can't do it. I can't do it.
I appreciate it though.
Well,
That's kind.
so
Very kind.
and it's, listen, I'm glad that you appreciate it, but it's not just to tickle your fancy or to butter up to you. Honestly, it is this is not for the sake of promotion. This is really just me saying this is the first scent I think of when I think of a green fragrance. And I think the reason for that is because, when we think about green perfumes, we think about, like we said before, that leaf alcohol, that like sharp green kind of quality that, moss accords and grassy accords often have. And that's typically coming from cis-3-hexanol, but other materials too can do this. Galbanum, for example, is a very sharp kind of, it's almost like the olfactory equivalent of a sword, in my opinion. It's a very bracing material. So when we think of green things, we normally think of like that top note quality. But something that Eider Antler did that I was really impressed by, and something that I really kind of come back to often, is it proved to me that this greenness in perfumery can be kind of soft and kind of like mossy, but not mossy because it's damp or it smells like moss, but mossy because it has that texture of being something almost lathery and cashmere like. I know you use cashmere in this, and I don't want to conflate those two things, but when I think of Eider Antler, I think of like the texture of like a thyme leaf, like the herb thyme leaf, or something along those lines, or like maybe the hairy stalk of a weed. Probably not the most like idyllic of descriptions for you there, John.
Like
maybe you don't want to use that.
No, no, I like that actually. That's good.
But it's really cool. I mean, I think you really did. You nailed this like sort of green texture that soft leafed plants have, and I've always really loved that about Eider Antler. So it is definitely the first thing I think of when I think of green fragrances. And obviously, scent aside, I mean, the color is pretty electrifying, I have to admit.
It's true. The green is green. I appreciate it. Thank you.
How about you, Nicola?
So I was interested when you were talking about greens being sort of dank and deep and dark and moist, because my choice is along those lines too, and this is one of the greenest fragrances I've ever smelled. It's Fathom 5 by Beaufort London.
Yeah.
It's a reference to being 5 fathoms deep, but to me, I don't really think of that when I smell it. I think of tomato leaves, that kind of greenhouse green. And I just get such a lot of savoury tomato leaf from it. Really vividly green, almost warm as well. And it's definitely got an earthy tone to it. But yeah, very savoury. To me, it's just tomato leaves, and love the smell of tomato leaves. It's one of the great joys of going to the greenhouse and picking a few tomatoes, is that smell that you get on your fingers that you can smell hours later. It's so tenacious, and it just really sticks to you. And Fathom 5 is one of those scents that it does go a little bit soapy at times. It's got a slightly clean facet as well as being earthy. It's got contradictions in there that I really like, and I think that's really nice. It feels like a whole painting painted just in different shades of green. So you've got tones and hues and light and dark and then texture too, but it's all just green. So it's a really good scent, and it's one that I really like to smell on men. I think it smells great. It's quite a magnetic sort of smell. I do wear it myself occasionally, but it's one that I really enjoy smelling, particularly on blokes. So yeah, it's great.
Now,
sorry, go ahead, John.
No, I was just going to say you said something about Beaufort that was interesting. You said about it's being full of contradictions, and I was going to say that seemed, when I think of Beaufort London, that's almost characteristic of a number of their fragrances. Like I was thinking, you know, a lot of these kind of sharp edges almost like clashing against each other. Having said that, though, I don't, you know, find any of the fragrances like impossible to wear or
Yeah.
be like overly crazily weird or something. I think they're
Yeah.
actually quite interesting to wear on skin, you know.
Yeah.
And
I totally agree. I think they've got a bit of a reputation for being challenging, but actually when you wear them, not that they're not, because they're all very bold and characterful, and there's doubtless going to be some that you just don't jive with for whatever reason. But the ones that you do, they are very much themselves. They're not apologetic about what they are. You know, with Fathom 5, they've gone, you know, both feet in green. With Lignum Vitae, I think it's Lignum Vitae, they've gone really cakey. There's one that smells like Madeline's, which is gorgeous. And with say something like Iron Duke or Rake and Ruin. Rake and Ruin, I thought is like it's a study in darkness. It's very dark, but you can sort of sniff it and go, meh, it's just dark. But actually, if you observe it and wear it and get to know it a bit better, you see shifts and tones in there. And that's what I get with Fathom 5, is that kind of shifting sense of greenery, very much centered around the tomato leaf and that spriggy greenery, but there is that sort of, it's like dappled somehow. And I know that's a bit of a mad thing to say, but it is like, it's like dappled sunlight coming through a forest canopy in a way. And I don't know how they've managed that. It's very clever.
Now, I wonder if you were to combine this fragrance with that basil street scent, if you will, that you were talking about before, and maybe some lactonic tones, if the result would be something that smelled like a caprese salad. That's that. Maybe that would skew to a gourmand, not to hint at something that's to come in this conversation.
And with you having said that, and I just want to sort of put a footnote to a conversation we should pick up at a future date. But when we were talking about green, I was thinking about, I was at a greenhouse recently and I was smelling fig leaves, and I thought, gosh, they're right in that weird center between, you know, the sort of milky coconutty smells and green smells and just sort of sweet gourmandy type stuff. And wow, what a strange spot to be. And I like, where the heck do fig leaves go, right? But anyway, for future conversation. Where does that bring us next? What is our next topic?
We're on fruity now. There's really, you know, only two categories in this part two that we're doing that were easy for me to choose a fragrance to represent. We just did one of them. Fruity is not one of those easy categories for me. I don't normally enjoy excessively fruity perfumes, despite how I think happy they are by design. So I guess maybe I can start with one that does really make me happy and really kind of keeps my interest all the time and never goes cloying on me. It's a salted green mango from Prin Lomros's Strangers Parfumery line. I think the success here is that, you know, Prin was really able to convey the idea of something that was underripe mango and other fruits for that matter, through focusing on the smell of the fruit's rind. And I'm not really sure how he avoided, you know, creating that like melony toned aquatic thing that happens when you combine aquatic or watery materials with fruity accords, but he definitely did avoid that trope. There's none of that in this. This is probably not the most complicated fragrance that I've ever smelled, but it's definitely very peaceful and joyous and reminds me of, you know, some of the happier days of summer, really. I think most fruity perfumes tend to really aim for that like juicy, ripe fruit kind of accord, and there's absolutely nothing wrong with that. There's a lot of beauty to be celebrated in those kinds of accords, but Prin was kind of clever here to show fruit at an earlier stage. I think somehow the effect of him doing that is that I associate this fragrance with fruit even more than I do with some of these, you know, ultra juicy, zesty like takes on the genre. So I really respect this piece of work for that reason. It's very cooling, relaxing, salt tinged kind of take on a tropical fruit perfume. I also really wanted to quickly just give a shout out to Pinewood Perfume, because their apple accord in a fragrance called Apple to Back is definitely my most favorite, take on apple. And I just couldn't talk about fruity fragrances without giving just a quick shout out to the almost absurd take on apple that he put out. It's pretty amazing stuff.
Oh, that's a great choice, Adam. Yeah, I've smelled that and it's a really nice perfume. So John, what's your selection for fruity?
Well, I reached for, I knew exactly what I would choose. And I thought, well, maybe I should, choose something different, because I don't want to go with the first choice, but I had to go with the first choice because it really is, it's a really good one. But like Adam, I didn't choose, I think, a typical fruit. I mean, there's a ton of fruit fragrances out there. My choice is Serge Lutens Araby. And what is, I think, important about this fragrance, and it was important for my development as a as someone who smells perfumes and whatnot. I bought this some years ago, but what I really love that they did with this is that it's based so much on dried and sort of stewed fruits. So sort of like that very particular idea of fruit that's been saved, like, I don't know if many people do this today, but years and years ago, people used to save fruit with sugar and liquor, like in a crock, essentially, and they would like take that out and bake it into things, or they would sort of mush it up and like serve it on ice cream and do these things with it. So they were sort of like these liquored up fruit. But that is pretty much what you smell here. It's this like highly concentrated, deep, sugary, almost amber colored fruit, if you will. And so in it are things like apricots and prunes and dates and figs and those sort of really concentrated sweet the fruits that you would come across in North Africa or the Middle East, those sort of dried fruits that had been like carried a long distance. And there's a kind of opulence to that I really love. So it's sort of the opposite of the kind of freshly picked, ripe, juicy. This is something where everything's been saved and preserved and kept a long time. And I love that comes through in the fragrance idea. Even in smelling it, it smells like you've opened a jar and you're smelling something deep inside it, as opposed to just, a freshly chomped on peach or something like that. And I love that aspect to it. And there's some spices and sandalwood in there as well, but I think it still remains very much a fruit-based fragrance. What about you?
Sounds gorgeous. It's not what I know actually, but
it's absolutely fabulous. Yeah.
Have you smelled Desert Suave by Liquides Imaginaires, which is
I have not, no.
Big favorite of mine. It sounds quite similar to that, because that's got a kind of preserved fruitiness, and I think sandalwood and sesame and things like that as well. So
I would definitely smell that one. That sounds like a fantastic one.
It's gorgeous. Yeah, it's really nice.
Okay.
So yeah, I really struggled with my selection for this, because I went to one straight away, and then I went to look at the notes, and I was like, it doesn't actually have that much fruit in it. So it's Tree by Neela Vermeer Creations, and it's gorgeous. It's such a gorgeous perfume. And I was just pulled up the notes. It's ginger, cinnamon, elemi, blackcurrant, basil, cardamom, sandalwood, saffron, clove, jasmine, incense, myrrh, agarwood, vanilla, amber, cedar, vetiver, patchouli, and oak moss. So there's not a whole lot of fruit in there. Blackcurrant and ginger, really. If you count that as a fruit. You might not, because it might be a spice. It's a root, isn't it? It's a tuber. So anyway, I digress. But the experience of wearing it to me is incredibly fruity. And I, in as much as notes lists aren't always reflective of the actual things that are in there, if you'd said to me this has got mango in it, I would believe you. Or a mango accord. It's got there's a big fruitiness taking up a lot of space in the middle of the fragrance. It's juicy. It's got that kind of succulence that, you know, when you bite into a ripe peach or something like that and the juice dribbles down your chin.
Mm-hmm.
It's got that about it. And even though there aren't a lot of fruity notes listed, I get such a fruity kind of impression when I smell it that I couldn't not really include it. If you like that sort, you do get a lot of the cinnamon and cardamom in there, but if you like this, it is one of those perfumes that is one that makes you catch your breath because it is so beautiful.
Mm-hmm.
Bertrand Duchefaux's the perfumer, and sometimes I think, you know, he's such a prolific perfumer that sometimes it feels a little bit like he's phoning it in, but clearly the chemistry between him and Nicola Vermeer is such that she is able to push him to do his very best work. And when he's on his very best work, I think he's incredibly talented.
Mm-hmm.
And this is possibly, I think, one of his greatest perfumes. And I know that's saying a lot. That's full of hyperbole right there, but it's gorgeous. It's absolutely gorgeous. And to me, it smells very fruity. So I completely love it. I think it's a superb scent. And yeah, if you like a bit of spice, you like a bit of sandalwood, and you like this kind of fruity succulence, then do try this one because it's just beautiful. And it lasts beautifully as well. It's really classy. It's a classy fruity to me. Because I think that's the thing with fruit, isn't it? It can sometimes, I love a green apple accord. I think a green apple accord in a shampoo, for example, is just a little bit of joy in the morning, or a shower gel. But because they're in things like that so often, they can become cheapened and they can become sort of throwaway and everyday and not special and ritualistic in the way that we might want fragrance to be. But I think Treillis for me does bring that level of sophistication and specialness to a fruity succulence that I really appreciate. And I'm all for just like a plain old green apple accord if there's one lying around, because just yummy.
Well, so that's the thing too, is especially when we're talking about fine fragrance, the thing that's difficult about fruit is that it's very difficult to make. Well, I'll give you a second there. No. So I'm not sure if like everybody realizes just how difficult it is to make a fruit accord that is like aiming at, seeming like itself, right? Whether it's peach or berries in particular can be very difficult. It's actually really difficult to create a fruit accord that has any kind of sense of naturalness at all. And obviously there are different styles of perfumery. You don't always have to create something to its most natural self. You don't always want to photocopy something, quote unquote, but just to get that juiciness that you were describing in the Nicola Vermeer creation, it's a lot of work, and it typically involves quite a few materials to be able to do justice to a fruit, whatever the fruit is.
Yeah, agreed. It can be very hard to do, and also to with the there can be just slight shifts that can sort of send a sort of fruit smell off into a different direction. And so to get some of that nuance of like you mentioned the word opulence, I think it takes a lot of skill to give that sense of opulence to fruit. That's quite an achievement in perfume. Absolutely.
I don't want to push us towards floral perfumes quite so quickly, but I will say, it's interesting because flowers are really complicated, just like fruit is very complicated. Most natural things in nature are made up of hundreds of, naturally occurring aroma chemicals anyway. So everything's pretty complicated when you take a GCMS analysis of it. But I will say that, it's funny that perfumers can fairly simply create a convincing, let's say, jasmine note. You know, jasmine is a beautiful, important flower. It's a very complicated scented nature, but in perfumery, you can convincingly portray the flower, at least in an impressionistic way, with 3 materials, maybe even 2 if you're really pushing it and pairing it intelligently with other things. You, John, correct me if I'm wrong, and maybe I am very wrong about this. Maybe, you know, Bertrand Duchaufour should be knocking on my door and saying, "Now wait a minute." I don't think you can do justice to a fruit accord and create something that smells convincingly of a fruit, no matter what fruit it is, in just 2 or 3 materials. Maybe I'm completely wrong.
It'd be very hard to do, and it'd be very hard to do that with any substantial life on the skin. I think is the other key. Is in order for it to have a life that actually lasts some time, that would be very hard to do with just like a handful of ingredients. Yeah, agreed. It's tough.
This is why I think I had so much trouble choosing a fruit scent that I really like, is because I typically do go for, if I'm going to go for a fruity thing, I'm going to typically go for something that has a bit of a natural bent to it, you know, something that smells like the fruit as you pick it up, rather than an impression of it. That's just my taste on fruity things. But yeah, it's a really complicated and fascinating category. And I'm really glad that I think it was either you, Nicola, or John who suggested fruity. I'm not sure who did, but I'm really glad that you did, because I might have even overlooked fruity as a whole category. And I'm certainly glad that we didn't, because it's a really fascinating and surprisingly complex category of fragrance.
Yeah.
Putting aside the obvious fact, there are, you know, how many hundreds of fruit species out there that you could choose from to imitate in perfume. But anyway, so our next sorry.
Just, you know, of course we had the fruit chuli, the fruit chuli trend, it seems to have died down a little bit recently, but you know, this kind of pairing of sticky fruits and patchouli was everywhere at one point, and very pleasant, very wearable, very you know, kind of a nice gateway for people who are maybe getting into slightly unusual or different perfumes, venturing away from the high street perhaps a little bit. Very friendly perfumes to bring people in, but very, very prevalent at one point. And it was interesting, I think, to see that, you know, like kind of oud, I think, has been growing in Western perfume popularity steadily and consistently, and it's remained on trend for 3, 4, 5 or more years now, whereas fruit chulis seem to, they were around and they existed, but then they just kind of skyrocketed, and they had quite a short half-life, it seems, a couple of years, and they're off a little again. That was my experience anyway. Would you say do you think that's a fair assessment?
Yeah, I would say so. And I also noticed that there were, I mean, at least in terms of looking through Fragrantica and some of the notes of a lot of those fruit type perfumes, is that you sort of ended up with this almost generic kind of like melange of fruits in the center, you know, that, you know, we're kind of pieced apart, but you're like, am I really smelling like, you know, a particular kind of nectarine and, you know, I don't know, sort of, I can't even think of something, but like, you know, nectarine and raspberries and whatever. I mean, it just kind of read to my nose as just like this mass of fruit thrown against a bit of patchouli and, you know, maybe some musk at the bottom, and, you know, it perhaps a bit of berries or something like that, you know. So which is not to say that those aren't, again, it certainly was pleasant, and I think it was sort of a gateway to more novel perfume combinations, but it did get a little bit muddled by as it was sort of trending down, I think. Yeah, exactly.
Definitely. Yeah.
I think so.
Oh, this was hard. This was really hard. I've smelled some absolutely amazing floral perfumes recently. To speak to your point, Adam, about creating a floral without actually any of the flower needing to be there, you know, using only synthetics. I recently smelled Tuberose My Love by Christophe Laudemille, which I'm reliably informed has no tuberose in whatsoever. It's only a recreation, but it's beautiful and it smells really convincing, and sort of nice and green and stemmy. But that's not my pick. That's not my pick. I'm digressing. My pick is California Reverie by Van Cleef and Arpels. Now, I should caveat this by saying the longevity of this scent is rubbish. So I tend to douse my clothes in it as well as my skin, because I get, it's not an all dayer, an hour or two at tops. But I had to buy it because it is so joyful. Big bouquet of white flowers, and it has that carefree, sunny, very settled weather that I associate with California. It's really happy, and I picked it because it's a bouquet rather than it just being one flower, because I had the whole internal debate of, well, do I pick rose, do I pick tuberose, do I pick gardenia, do I pick jasmine, which flower do I pick? And so I went with this in the end because it just has that sort of happy exuberance of a posy of white flowers being carried on the beach in California. And it's funny, it's just such a joyful, happy scent, and it's a real mood lifter. And the only sad thing about it is how fleeting it is, but otherwise it's just gorgeous. And yeah, I'm gonna tell you the notes list for it as well, because
I'd be curious. Yeah, I haven't smelled this one yet.
it's just lovely. Neroli, mandarin orange, jasmine sambac, frangipane, beeswax, and vanilla. So it's not even listing that many notes. To me, it's a relatively easily available fragrance as well. They sell it in our local department store, and we're quite poor for niche fragrances where I live. And so it is a more readily available kind of fashion brand scent. But it's, aside from the longevity, it's such a beautifully composed fragrance. It's got a story to it. It's got a life, on skin. It feels like it's communicating something, but it's not. It's not one of those that you get sticker shock, I think you called it, Adam, from looking at the price of. It's certainly not. You wouldn't say it was cheap, but it isn't super expensive for particularly, kind of more unusual perfumes, and it's just. It feels like it's a cut above a lot of them that I've smelled. Somehow, just the way it's put together, it balances beautifully and it hangs together in a really attractive way. So yeah, I had to get a bottle of that, because I just even if I sometimes sort of put it on before bed, because I know that it'll definitely be gone by morning, but it's just one of those that you think you kind of go to bed a little bit happier.
I like the idea that you were kind of referring to almost like a setting involving, like, the fact that you mentioned it's sort of like a bit beachy and West Coasty, and like that's an interesting way to sort of frame the idea of a floral perfume in a particular setting and time. I could almost even sense a time of day, and like kind of that's really interesting.
Yeah.
Floral
Well,
fragrance.
if you think that's interesting, then wait till you hear my pick, John.
Nice. Oh, very curious, very curious. Well, why don't you tell me your pick there?
I'm hoping it matches his shirt.
Sadly, you'd be disappointed. So it's called Blue Hyacinth Cologne from Joe Malone, and so this kind of came out of nowhere for me. I hadn't really. I think anybody who's been into fragrance for a little bit now probably is at least somewhat familiar with the Joe Malone line, just because they're everywhere and in almost every airport I've ever been in. That's for sure. I don't know much about the line other than the few things that I've kind of picked up at stores and whatnot. But I was really interested in the note of hyacinth as a thing, and this really kind of came out of nowhere in that respect. I just found it and really enjoyed it. But to your point, John, I've always wanted, floral perfumes to make more references to a setting, in this case, a garden, than they often do. I think floral fragrances, focus typically on like the petally, the indolic, the heady aspects, which is great. I mean, those are beautiful things to focus on, and it makes sense why that is. Other times, flowers can be used for can be used to create a bouquet, a new smell altogether that is the combination of more than one kind of flower. But I think blue hyacinth is both unique and in its own kind of way representative too of the floral category, because it puts the flower that it's named after, as well as geranium. Don't worry, Nicola, it's not too heavy. It's not a heavy geranium perfume, but it puts the flower sort of in the setting. In this case, I would imagine it as a garden in late spring. And at this point, any flower that's coming up in spring typically isn't really releasing the full potency of its fragrance until a little bit later into the season. So this is sort of like right before the point where a flower is like throwing off all of its, more typical scent. So, you get some of like the cooler, earthier soil kind of notes, but it's not like you're feeling unclean wearing it. You get kind of that kind of snappy chlorophyll, leafy greenness too. And then as it kind of wears on the skin and sort of, theoretically blooms on the skin, if you will, it starts to heat up and it starts to smell a little bit more like a flower. And at that point, I just think it's a pretty cool accomplishment of, especially kind of coming from Joe Malone, who sort of focuses on minimalism in both note and perfume structure and advertising, to create this like, walking through the day and kind of walking through the season interpretation of a flower. And I think that's really interesting and really cool. And it certainly is very relaxing experience. I think that, flowers, they're often marketed as like this sultry thing. And I guess I can see why that is, but I think maybe it's just my own desire to see relaxation interpreted in perfume. But I think flowers can also be a very relaxing, calming kind of scent too. I guess it depends on what your experience is in terms of, did you get outside much? When you do go outside, are you in an urban setting? Are you in a countryside setting? Are you in something in between? I know everybody kind of brings these personal background and experience to fragrance, but there's something about these springy florals that like really relax me. And I think that's a really special thing about Blue Hyacinth Cologne from Joe Malone. So that's my pick. I
think
really, sorry, go ahead.
Hyacinth is a really interesting one as well. Do you guys have in America this thing where hyacinths are typically grown, or certainly frequently grown inside? Because
you can, they're often like prior to Easter and things. You can, or the bulbs are forced to grow earlier and stuff.
Because we have a lot of that here as well, and they do grow outside here too, but they're sort of sold very prevalently quite early in the season, as you say. And I think they go from gorgeous to disgusting overnight. They push the stem up, and you've got that anticipation, and then, like you say, you've got that whisper of it, and then maybe over the space of like 3 or 4 days it builds in intensity, and then one day, and it'll have been nice the day before, you come down the next day and you think, oh god, that's putrid now, and it just suddenly turns, and then because my mum grows them a lot, and I'll sometimes be at a house, and there'll be many times I'll be sat there thinking, oh, it's just gorgeous, it's so lovely to have bulbs in the house, and then I'm like, what is that smell? And I don't know if it's one of those things that like when the milk goes off, some people can't smell it until it's really rancid, but there's something about off hyacinths that really upsets me.
Well, I think it, what that makes me think of, because I remember distinctly one Easter when, I'd been away and I came back, and the hyacinths, which is, they had that absolutely indolic smell. And And what it reminded me of is just how powerful
Yeah.
the smell of these bulb flowers are. I mean, like unlike any other flower, that's just so unbelievably strong. And it makes me think of how, to me, spring is always metaphoric of just this absolute force of nature. Like it's not gentle at all. It's very strong and forceful. And all of the bulb flowers are like that. You know, they just have no subtlety in a way. Although this like full explosion of the flower is this very gentle, you know, slightly kind of, I always smell a bit of wine or grapeness in hyacinths that I love as well too. Which I don't really smell in many other flowers, which is just a little delicate and wonderful prior to, you know, of course, this full rampage.
Like, I suppose it's that, you know, tickle me gently with the chainsaw, isn't it? This is the tickling bit before the chainsaw bites.
Yes, right. Right, exactly.
So what's yours, John?
Absolutely. So I've gone, the floral topic is so huge. We can, at some point, it'd be wonderful to go into sort of more specialized single flowers. I realize I've chosen something that I think is familiar to both of you, which I didn't realize till late in my selection process, so it's kind of funny. But I wanted to choose something that wasn't terribly common, but I thought was very, at least to my nose, representative of a very full bouquet of flowers and a very full perfume from like start to finish, the whole sort of story. And that's from Jerome's Studio Elegy, which for me is an amazing floral perfume. And I mean, it's far more than floral perfumes, but what I think I love so much about this is that it's got so much of so many different kinds of flowers. And God, it's and it also, you could pick it apart for the different pieces of flowers that are in here, but you could also just enjoy that sort of larger whole, the sum of the greater than the sum of the parts that sort of exists above it, which is that slightly cosmetic-y, almost like pastille candy kind of, you know, gentle floral candy aspect that rises above all of it. And then you have this very complex base of, you know, of some ambergris, and there's some patchouli and cedar and oak moss and everything underneath it. And I think what I love so much about the whole perfume, though, is just the sort of the sensation that, again, sort of like what you were talking about, Nicola, where it does feel definitely of the outdoors, but it also has this idea of the outdoors brought inside, at least to me. Like, you know, someone made a distinct effort to try to capture a lot of the outdoors into a bottle for you as a keepsake, you know. But there's so many wonderful aspects of different flowers in here that you couldn't, like I said, you could pick apart the different elements to it. But you know, there's these wonderful little bits of jasmine and orange flower and geranium, sorry, and lavender, and you know, some little bit of bergamot at the top, and there's some heather, and I just recently smelled some more fragrant heather, and heather is a very subtle smell to me, but it has a distinct smell that's here. Anyway, I found it it's a lovely perfume, and I really recommend people giving this a go. Again, an elegy from Jerome's Studio. A beautiful take on a kind of beginning to end sense of floracity in fragrance. Really love this one.
One of the things I think is really good about it as well is that, you know, obviously there's a huge sector of people who are into fragrance who love sort of vintage scents. And to me, I think Elegy is one of the most modern vintage scents, or more vintage modern scents, that I've smelled in a long time. Like, it doesn't feel like they've tried to recreate a vintage scent just for the sake of it and just to show that they can. It feels like they've taken something that might have inspired a vintage scent and allowed it to inspire a modern scent somehow.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it.
And I think it will really appeal to people who are sort of thinking, well, there's not that much in the market for me because I really liked all these big bouquet type scents of the past. I would say try this, because I think it might surprise you, and it might be a very modern perfume that actually you can relate to and you can enjoy.
It's a really nice way to put it, because I do hear, I think all of us hear from so many people this just sadness for a certain kind of signature among fragrances that is missing from modern perfumery. And this is definitely a more modern take on a big kitchen sink, everything in the kitchen sink kind of a floral perfume of previous decades, but done with a modern eye. It's not just a kind of let me recreate something from 1980 or something like that, which is really refreshing, and yet is to me very keeping with the idea of what makes a great floral perfume. Yeah. Really like this one.
Yeah, great choice. Great choice.
Nicola and I reviewed that one that one and the other that was released around the same time from Joram together. And
yeah, that's right.
Something that I wrote in the review, I do have to admit, you know, sometimes when something has a particularly present powdery quality, I find it really difficult to kind of sniff through that and find other facets. So maybe I'm going to have to revisit Elegy for that reason, to try to take a little bit more time with it, but that I already gave it. But I really do think it's a great example of what Nicola was saying, that like that kind of newer take on a classical accord. I will say, you know, something that I kept on thinking when I wore it and spent time with it initially was that it's a very graceful scent. And I don't know exactly what that means, but that's just sort of like, you know, the thrall of it is like, I had that word just sort of, you know, at the front of mind. And I stand by it. From what my memory of it is, and hearing you two describe it, I think graceful is a decent descriptor of it.
I think you're absolutely right. Absolutely right. And to me, it conjures somebody who's perhaps in their 40s or 50s, very chic, steely grey haircut, but very, very chic, nicely understated clothes, but really good quality, who is both a lovely kind of inspiring person and also really like scary. You know, like one of those people who is sort of that combination of really warm but also really steely somehow, and really I detect something. I think graceful is a really good word for it, but I also detect something in there that's a little bit austere, a little bit held back, a little bit sort of not aloof, because it's not unfriendly, but just almost like the person that Elegy would embody, or would be embodied by Elegy. You wouldn't want to get on the wrong side of them. You know, there's something, you want their approval. You don't want them to disapprove of you. Nice. There's a strength to it. You know, it's floral, but there's a real backbone to it, which I think is really interesting. And you know, Joram's such a great house. They're so exciting.
Yeah.
And everything. I think there's a Joram lens that they put on stuff, which I think is really cool.
That was and I also like it brings up, like, to me, there's also a very strong color association I kind of have with this. There's this very limited palette of sort of grays and pinks and purples to this fragrance that is interesting. You know, I always associate colors with florals often, and this was a very kind of like limited palette of color, which to me does represent that slightly severe kind of a personality, which is really intriguing, very intriguing.
Yeah.
I think we just really ran quite a gamut of floral perfumes there.
Yeah, I think we did,
very much so, indeed, very much. And that brings us next to leathers, I believe.
Okay, so I have a question. If I'm gonna start, have either of you ever thought that you had absolutely no interest in a particular note, only to find later that it is the crux of some of your favorite compositions?
Oh, it's interesting.
Yes,
Yes.
leathers.
Well, I guess me too on that one, Nicola, because I don't know. I've smelled some of like the uber leather perfumes, and I have almost no interest in them. I think when I started, when I first started like getting really heavily into fragrance, I think I remember smelling Tuscan leather, and I thought that was really kind of interesting then because I had never smelled anything like it. But then I wore it a few times, and I was like, it's just not for me. I like its boldness, but it just wasn't for me. I just didn't need to wear it anymore. And then I don't know. I've always found like absolutely no inspiration from the idea of a leather fragrance, and I have no clue why that is because it's really a fascinating genre, being completely a synthetic genre. I mean, I guess some perfumers might use real castoreum to kind of boost a leathery facet or a musky facet of leather, but most of that's synthetic now too. So it's an all synthetic note that you really don't have a naturally occurring bearing for. And in that respect, I think, it deserves a lot of attention. It deserves to have so many entries as it does in its genre. But for whatever reason, I've never thought to myself, I really need to find a leather fragrance. And I kind of came upon one. In that respect, it was accidental that I came upon it, but it's something called 84 dash, the full title is the number 84 and then Youth But Not Innocence by a relatively new house called OSM. And I'm not exactly sure what OSM stands for. I'm assuming it's some kind of acronym, but it is online. It is listed on our Fragrantica database. It's a really interesting floral leather. I maybe shouldn't say floral. I should just say leather. It's a very animalic and, well, I shouldn't say that. I get ahead of myself with these descriptions because it's got quite a few things in it, and it's easy to kind of stumble over yourself when trying to describe it, as I am currently doing. Okay, so it's got plenty of other musky materials going on for it in that respect. It's got like an indolic floral quality from a jasmine accord. It's got some animalic musks going on, and it's more than just, I know that leather can skew animalic depending on how it's treated, but this is like leather plus animalic note. And it's even got some soapy musks in there too. And so it kind of creates this, I'd sprayed it on a strip earlier. It kind of creates that same sort of kind of clean, kind of raunchy, kind of somewhere in between accord that you might find in something like a Kouros, or like I should stress, the modern iteration of Kouros. I know there are so many Kouros fans out there that if I don't clarify that this is the most modern interpretation of Kouros, they might be misconstrued. So it has this, inner contrast between agrestic and polished that I find really interesting and really representative of the note of leather. It's got leather, smoke, hay, and vetiver notes paired against something that you might associate with like a soap melange of like neroli, soapier musks, black pepper. These are notes that you might see in a soapier accord. So all pinned against jasmine and sort of focusing on the jasmine and sort of leading like a funnel to it. And jasmine, of course, is a flower that can skew both pretty clean and pretty dirty. So I thought that was another kind of layer of this puzzle, right? It's sort of like an accidental comment on the nature of leather in perfume being both raw and refined, and how that note can kind of skew, almost filthy, something that you would raise eyebrows in a room wearing, but it can also skew very suave, and very suede and like have associations of being like sultry and refined. So it's a really fascinating note that I have criminally ignored almost in my dabbling in fragrance, and it's something that after discovering OSM's number 84, I think I really have to pay more attention to this note in fragrance, and it's a really fascinating note.
Sounds like a fascinating brand as well. Like I am not one that I know, but it does. You've sold me on it. It sounds brilliant.
It's really cool. Just make sure that you're in the mood to at least smell something animalic. I know that's a whole other category of fragrances that we haven't yet assigned to one of these talks that can steer people in wildly different directions. So I don't think it's really that bad. It's not like on the same level of aggressive animalic as something like that. What is it? Oud Infini from not Oud Infini, but the Dusita Oud.
Yeah, that's
Yeah.
I love the Dusita Oud. I know it's unbelievably strong, and people get crazy about it. I love it as a little bit as a novelty item too. Like, where do you smell this one, right? But yeah, one of the things you mentioned there about leather that I find so interesting is that it's such a like I would wonder what, you know, a leather fragrance from, how can I say this, like a leather fragrance from 100 years ago, 150 years ago would be so interesting, because, you know, we're essentially smelling the chemicals, spices, and whatever that are used to tan and treat leather, and that has become what we now know to be the smell of leather, which now we usually create through synthetic ingredients. But it's gone through such a weird history, right? Because you had I know for the longest time, leather products that were geared toward women, like wearing gloves, for instance, for a long time had these, they were like lilac scented, or they had like very delicate flower scent. So that was kind of birth to the very Hermes type of like leather floral scent, you know. And then there's all these sort of interesting, leathers had these interesting strains based on the kind of confusing history, or like the parts of the world where leather was treated a certain way, like in Morocco or in Russia, or, you know, in England, or, you know, so there's all these subcategories that I don't even know that much about, really. But I know that perfumery has had kind of this very large creative canvas on which to, you know, work with and make some choices about what leather should smell like based on different profiles and whatnot.
It's
Yeah.
really interesting because there's like the history of perfume, but then there's also the history of the things that perfume references, which I think is kind of what
Yeah,
you're talking about, which is
yeah.
it just is so fascinating to imagine how the difference, you know, what the difference was in leather tanneries regionally and historically, and
Right,
how
right.
that's really, you know, you sort of, it's almost like a kind of an illusion of a mirage of an illusion of a mirage. You can't ever get to the truth of it, but
Yeah,
actually the exploration is the really exciting and interesting thing. And I guess that is one of the facets of leather, though, is thinking, oh, I don't really like leather, but then it's one of the things that I always say to people who you know, they say to me things like, I don't like rose. I said, well, actually, that rose can be so many different things in perfumery, and I think that's very true of leather.
yeah,
Um,
agreed.
you know, a leather is not a leather is not a leather. It can be more suede, it can be, you know, rougher, it can be more animalic, it can be really highly like a processed leather that's very soft, or it can be a working leather that's stained and oily.
Mm.
And they're not all the same. I think you could probably study leather as a category, maybe even more so than some of the other categories. You know, you really could make a study of these scents and find a whole interesting and varied world contained within them.
I think so. I do. What did you choose for your leather fragrance, Nicola?
So I went with Craveninum, Pierre Guillaume, because I wanted to bring a Pierre this week.
You decided to break your own enforced rule from last time.
Yeah. Yeah, I was like, well, people will think that I've been kidnapped and replaced by an imposter if I don't have some Pierre in here. And you know, it sort of goes to what you were saying, Adam. Like, I was thinking, oh, leather, not really into that. And then I started looking at my collection and thinking, oh, well, that's got leather in, and that's got leather in too. Well, that one has as well. And I tend to not love the really full-on leathers. Personally, for me, although I, the hill I will die on is that anybody can wear whatever they want. But personally, for me, I feel that they skew a little bit too masculine. So this one is one that I do wear and is leathery, but also softer. It's an easy leather. I think Quavenina means poisonous leather, but to me, this is really friendly leather, and it goes sort of to that. We were talking then about the scented gloves. It has that. When he's waking up, it has that sort of. It's a little bit powdery. It's got a sort of orange blossomness in there. It's got kind of leather facet. Absolutely. I don't think it's poisonous. I think it's quite friendly. And I can imagine a Victorian or Edwardian lady perhaps pulling on some very well-worn but nice quality kid leather gloves that she's had scented, maybe with a little talcum powder inside. So it's a leather that skews, either way depending on who wants to wear it. But to me, and on my skin, it's a feminine way to wear leather, and it's quite a delicate way to wear leather. I think it's got orange blossom and lemon. I don't get much lemon out of the top, and then coconut, which I sort of get, but also don't. It's almost like I get it in an abstract way as opposed to actually smelling of coconut. And then leather, myrrh, musk, honey, and cedar in the base. So the sort of base of it is the heavier aspect, and you get that sense of, which I really like actually when perfumes do this. You get them and they start and they're all light and airy, and then they kind of go woo into this. You can almost feel them slow down and deepen, and you get that much more heavy makes it sound stodgy, and I don't mean stodgy, I mean resinous, sort of resonating bass.
That idea of leather and honey sounds really nice. That's a combination.
Yeah, because you get the sort of the leatheriness, but then there's this hint of sweetness. So yeah, it's an interesting one. It's an easy one. I think if you are unsure about leathers, it's a nice one to try. It's true to a leather, but it has these adornments that make it a bit easier to wear and a bit easier to get into.
I do like leather fragrances, although when you mentioned the like what note did you not think you would like and then you realize you like so much, that for me is tobacco ends up being my note that just shows up everywhere in fragrances that I love. So I have it's sort of a flanker of a classic leather, and which I would say either the flanker or the original is fine, but it's Hermès's Bellamy, and this is considered pretty much like I would say it's like the sort of standard. I think it came out, and people will nab me on this one, but I want to say it came out in like 1980 or very early 80s. This is the Bellamy Vetiver version, which just it's very close to the original Bellamy, but it just ramps up a tiny bit of there's a little bit more vetiver, but it's sweetened by there's like a little bit of iris in here, and like obviously more vetiver and a little bit of amber in here. But this is sort of a classic slightly sweet, very much aromatic leather. So you'll find things like juniper berry. This actually has some basil in it as well. There is a bit of civet, some spice, but it's it's leather that's warmed up. It's not cool leather. It's very much sophisticated leather. It's leather you wear, it's something you wear more kind of like fancy dress to go out, sort of leather fragrance. I've always seen the Bellamy line, and actually all of Hermès's leathers, and they're so good at their leather fragrances, and is in that they've always done that wonderful, their best skill is combining iris and leather. I mean, that seems to be in that just like utterly artful combination of those two things together to create this very fascinating third thing, which they do something utterly magical with that, which is that sort of very sophisticated and rich, almost kind of a buttery leather that has a tinge of floracity to it, which nobody seems to do it in the manner that they do it. And it's particularly beautiful in the Bellamy line, and wonderful fragrance. I would say it's not of that kind of really dark, deep sort of, cutting kind of like, hard edged niche sort of leather, but definitely more of the sophisticated line. And particularly for people who like iris as well, I think it has enough iris to even be considered kind of an iris fragrance. But I like when leather can be used. There's a lot of examples of great like leather heavy perfumes out there, and I love it when it can be used really as an equal partner to show other things. That's for me what I find I end up liking the most about leather fragrances. I also don't mind a really nice sharp acidic leather as well too, but this is a really nicely balanced one as well.
Would you say that was a kind of more daytime fragrance or an evening fragrance?
This to me is more of a great question, and I would tend to probably say it's going to veer more toward an evening fragrance or something you'd put on late afternoon with the goal of wearing it to go out somewhere. Absolutely, it's that kind of a, yeah, like it's not casual at all. Like I've never seen Bellamy as being casual fragrance. It's very much a not an everyday wear at all. It's just too rich and dressed up.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And how does what I imagine to be the coolness of the iris play against the more skin hidey type leatheriness?
Yeah, it absolutely is a yin and yang, and they complement one another so well, where there's a the iris has both of the kind of like that brighter candied edge, but also that sort of fattiness of orris root together. And the leather has both of that sort of fuzziness of suede, but that sort of acidic edge of like, of the things you use to tan the actual like kind of lyes and of tanning compounds together. So it's sort of like this swirling of the two together in this very balanced whole in a way that creates like an equal acidic alkaline kind of mixture. Very interesting the way it's done. I don't know quite how they do it, but it's a bit of magic.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Sounds great.
Yeah, it's quite nice.
This was a tricky one for me as well. Before I get going, I would like to ask you both a question.
Ooh, yeah.
Where do you stand on this idea that gourmands are inelegant? And do we care?
Well, it's hard because if I'm thinking about just food, right? Like I'm a big food person, and I always struggle because like if given the opportunity, I will go on conversationally about it. And the risk there for me is that I don't want to come off like self-important, because I think sometimes when people go on and on about food, sometimes they start to have like this like pretense in how they talk about it, and they give food pretense, and food should be for everyone. So in that respect, when I think about bringing like elegance to a gourmand fragrance, I wonder if like I have that just that leftover association of like I don't want to be like kind of full of myself about this, right? Like I think the beauty of gourmands is that they can be at least inelegant, but in a good way, like inelegant, but like approachable and friendly and nice and just pleasant. And I think that that's fine. But I also don't want to take something away where it can definitely be more than that. So I go back and forth on it myself, and I think it's a very legitimate question to ask.
I remember there was an interesting question. This is going back quite a few years. There was a celebrity, celebrity I want to use in quotes, from Jersey Shore TV show, who created a fragrance. And I believe that one of the accords or notes within it was a cupcake accord. And I think that this was at an earlier stage of the sort of gourmand trend, I think. And, you know, there was a lot of conversation on the exact topic. I think people may not have used the elegant word inelegant, but they may have just said, you know, what is this? You know, that's not a real note. That's not a perfume note, but it got precisely at the heart of what you're saying, which is, you know, are some of the notes within fragrance have they gone a little too far? And that's where I thought there is some interesting detail here, right? Where certain, how shall I say, prepared foods, you know, like if one were to say, you know, that this fragrance has a macaroni and cheese accord, you know, I might call foul there and say that's a little too specialized for, you know, it's very gourmand, but I think we should step back from that, you know. And even the cupcake accord, I'm like, well, what is that exactly? I mean, there's a couple things. That's cake, it's frosting, it's sprinkles on top, it's paper, you know, I don't know, whatever. It just seemed like you're loading a lot of things in there. So I guess that it's always going to be a valid question, and I'm glad it's a valid question. And having said that, I'm fascinated by gourmand fragrances. I'm fascinated by gourmand notes that show up in fragrances and how they have completely changed the playing field of perfumes, and that they've opened up completely new avenues and new approaches to fragrance that we just didn't think were possible before. And in a way, I think this kind of goes to what Adam was saying a little bit. They've sort of created an interesting democratization of fragrance too, where more common smells like kitchen smells are now have been elevated to the same thing as like a gardenia, you know, and that they can have equal footing. And I love that idea. I think that there's something really cool and approachable about that. Having said that, I'd love to hear your thoughts on that as well too.
Well, I just think we need to stand clear of ever getting bin juice into, you know, that's the ultimate kind of animalic, fecal, dirty kind of. So maybe I should compose that and trademark it as, you know, Eau De bin juice. I think you're right. Talking about really specific ones though, I want to give a shout out to, I think I'm going to say her name wrong probably, but Hilde Soleani,
Yes.
sometimes called the Queen of Gourmand Fragrances, and possibly justifiably so. I smelled one of her fragrances, which was inspired by what are they called? Like not shallots and not scallions, and not those because they're spring onions, but you know, the seafood.
Is that the oyster one?
It's not there's one that's like oysters fried in butter.
Yeah. No, I've smelled it, and it's fabulous.
It's amazing. Yeah, it's amazing.
No,
It's
it's
so
incredible.
good.
Incredible smell. Yeah.
It's got like a kind of marine, salty, freshwater,
Right.
super fresh seafood.
But really
spice.
savory.
Really savoury.
Yeah.
And then it's that like warm butter. And it's just brilliant. And you can almost, like, it's weird when I smell it, I get that sense of salt crystals as well. You can almost see the little flecks of salt. And it's beautiful. And it's so, I mean, what a weird thing to make a perfume out of, but she's done such a good job of it. It's just, beautiful.
Great reference point, I think, for us.
So I think you're right. I think we might not want to go macaroni and cheese or bin juice, but I'm willing to smell weird things like oysters fried. But it's not oysters, it's the other one that I
like mussels or clams or something, or
The ones that are they're like round and
Escargot? No,
I'm gonna have to Google it.
No.
See.
Well, now we have to know. Yeah, no. Now we have to know.
We do, right? Yeah.
What am I thinking of? And it's because it's getting quite late here, and my brain's scallops. That's what I'm thinking.
Okay.
Oh, scallops.
Scallops.
Okay, right. Got
there
it.
we go. Phew.
Yeah,
I think it might be scallops in butter.
Okay.
and
That makes sense now.
Just super. So yeah.
Okay.
Sorry for that, like brain malfunction.
No, please. Don't.
But yeah, so for me, Gourmands, probably like most things sit on a spectrum. I think we're newer to them, so that spectrum isn't perhaps as fixed as it might be for something like gardenia. And we're used to thinking of flowers as elegant. So perhaps they always are going to have a leg up on cupcake accords. But I too, I really like a good gourmand. I really like the comfort that they bring. Putting on a gourmand can be very cozy and comforting. It's got that nostalgia of, perhaps a parent baking or a grandparent or getting a treat. It's got all that association that I think is really nice and nostalgic and homely. So on that, for me, Milky Perfumes they are something that I've got a bit of an obsession with and have a sort of long-standing fascination with almost. But so I decided today to bring Milk Musk by Molton Brown. Now, talking of Hilde Soliani, she does one called Hot Milk, which is superb, which is a similar thing. It's a kind of warm milk accord with spices. And it's very photorealistic, very beautiful, but not as easy to get hold of as Milk Musk. Now, this is they do an Eau de Parfum version and Eau de Toilette, and this is the EDT, which I think wears a little bit better. The EDP, I think, I don't tend to get the same longevity out of it, actually. And it wears much closer to the skin. I find it a little bit less, it opens a little bit less pleasantly, whereas the EDT version I just find has got that little bit of a lift and a little bit of life that the EDP doesn't have. And it is a really good milk accord fragrance. It's not the most complicated fragrance you're ever going to smell. It's cozy and comforting. There's something I get in there that's ever so slightly green. It's something a little bit fresh. And then around it, there's this sort of, it's sort of wrapped around this sort of green something is very smooth, very pleasant milk accord. And it's quite linear from start to finish. It doesn't change a whole lot. It lasts quite well. And it's just really comforting, nice, homely. Yeah, it's a good scent, and it's not very expensive. And it just does what it says on the tin. It's milky and musky, and you're going to be satisfied by it. If you're looking for a milk musk perfume, then this is a great buy. If you can't get hold of Hilde's Hot Milk, because that's also brilliant.
Well, that's the thing about gourmands is typically like if it doesn't do what it says on the tin, is it like effective, right? Because I think this is the challenge with naming a fragrance after what's in it or something in it is like, okay, well, if it doesn't immediately scream that, you might hear somebody say, well, actually it's more of a and I don't know, I'm not against anybody naming a fragrance after what's in it. I will say though, it's funny that like in the gourmand category, so many of them are very blatant about advertising what's in the bottle. right?
Yeah, right. Yeah, what it is, right? It would like, yeah, it's almost sort of a bit of a test. Like, I know exactly what you're saying, right? That it's almost a test of the sort of proof. Like, see, it really is what we said it was,
It really
you
is
know,
a cupcake.
right, right, yeah, exactly. Right.
And I do wonder how much of that is because a lot of gourmands typically, maybe not in the niche sector, but if you look at the fragrant landscape as a whole, they are marketed to young tween and teenage girls.
That's true.
And there's the whole, let's not get into the whole patriarchal thing of girls must smell of vanilla frosting and boys must smell of concepts, but a lot of this is pushed at teenage girls. However, that I think maybe leads to it being a little bit overlooked as a valid kind of sector of scent, because like, oh well, it smells of cupcakes, it must be crap. But actually there's some really good stuff that smells of, as Adam and I have talked about, ex Idolo's Love and Crime. It's a cake accord, but it's a cake accord in a fancy bottle that isn't shaped like a cupcake, and it's a cake accord with a kind of sophisticated story and sophisticated niche marketing around it, and some great longevity and some other lovely things that you would confer from the quality of the scent. But if that was put in a cupcake shaped bottle and priced at $19.99, you would get teenage girls buying it, and it would be pushed to them, and they would be like, yeah, this is a fantastic scent. And it is a fantastic scent, but it's a fantastic scent existing in a niche space as opposed to existing in this very easily dismissed space because it's teenage girls.
Right. That's a really interesting and fair point, an important point as well. Yeah, context kind of changes our perception of things, doesn't it?
Yeah, massively.
Yeah, huge.
So with that being said, I think I chose my pick because, I mean, like you had said about yours, Nicola, it does do what it says on the tin. With a name like Pistachio Gelato, I think there's really no room for misunderstanding.
And it smells just like basil, but anyway, but please tell us.
Well, so Nicola, I almost chose the one that we discovered in New York at the Lucky Scent Bar, and Exodolo scent, and we already talked about that at length, I think. So I chose this one because another thing that you had mentioned earlier, and that we both kind of spent a little time with at that shop, was Hildy Soliani scent. And so I really want the creator of Pistachio Gelato from I think an kind of under the radar somewhat house called Ganache Parfums. I think they deserve more credit than they get, is what I'm getting at. I really wish Hildy and Ganache would like collaborate on something, because I feel like they have very similar approaches where they create, it's not just like photorealistic representations of desserts. It's just like all the best parts of desserts without any of like the cloying parts, because I really typically can't stand gourmands. I just, and it's nothing to do with what they're associated with. It's nothing to do with like perceived, lack of grace or refinement. It is everything to do with how sweet they can be. And I just can't with sometimes it literally will give me a headache if I'm not careful. So especially the ones that feel like they kind of coat the inside of your nostrils with that richness. John, do you know what that is? Like that's something that I've never bothered to venture in or learn about in my own creation of fragrances, because I really cannot stand that stuff, and I don't want to experience it, even if it has a function. I can't do it.
No, I don't know what's actually at play there, or why you're so particularly sensitive. I do know, I think some of it may just be reaction to like things like ethyl maltol, which is just so overly synthetically ridiculously sweet, and particularly prevalent in a lot of the Mugler fragrances, for example, which, and just the prevalence of it in a lot of stuff. And some people just don't, it can be very cloying. I also remember reading somewhere there's a problem in our brains function sometimes when we are smelling something that's particularly sweet, but there isn't a corresponding like something in your mouth, and so there's a disconnection. Like, why am I smelling this, but I'm not eating something? Like, there's a, do you know what I mean, a disconnect.
Well, knowing me, that's probably the problem.
Any event, but I mean, a completely unscientific way I'm putting it, but I think at some point, yeah, there was some study, I believe I read somewhere about the disconnection there. Yeah,
some wire is crossed in me. I really can't do it when it's so sweet. But so almost any gourmand that I do end up enjoying is sort of in spite of myself and in spite of itself in many ways. So I tend to really like the ones that are kind of a little less edible and a little bit more like a zoomed out depiction of food or drink. I'm classifying, I don't want to like, drinks are gourmand too, but I kind of think about like fragrances that are mirrored after, let's say, cocktails or something like that, or wine notes. I kind of picture those as gourmands, honorary gourmands too. And so I kind of picture, the ones that I like best being ones that are like that zoomed out depiction of them. And so I wanted to give some attention to Pistachio Gelato from Ganache, some attention, because I do think it deserves more credit than it receives. And I chose it because it is pretty accurately named. It does remind me of being in a ice cream shop. As much as I like imaginary authors, it gives me that kind of sensation even more than imaginary authors' literal collaboration with an ice cream shop. I think A Whiff of Waffle Cone is the title. That's a great gourmand. If you like gourmands at all, you have to check that one out too. But Ganache's Pistachio Gelato is really interesting because it's got the nuttiness, which is already a difficult achievement. I think nuttiness in perfume is really interesting and really cool and really fascinating and something I'd like to see more of, but difficult, I think, to do. And it's got that kind of, it's enough of a salty, nutty effect to make it, characteristic of pistachios, or as you might say in Italy, pistacchio. There you go, Hildy, if you're watching. I will say that the really cool part about it is that there's also like that dairy kind of bent, like, again, bringing some life to the gelato part of the name. There is that rich, I will say, ice cream in Europe is just better. Dairy products in Europe, yeah, you know what I mean, Nicola.
It's Italian ice cream. It's not even Europe. It's Italian. Oh,
true, fair.
Delicious.
But dairy products outside of the US, less pasteurized, the better. I mean, it's so great and so rich and so full of other things going on that you just don't get in milk products here in the United States. And it has that complexity that I love in, dairy products from abroad. There's also that like biscuit kind of waffle cone kind of note that I'm really fond of as a scent in general. It's a happy memory for me, but it's also just a very comforting kind of scent too. It's like a pale, semi-sweet, semi-salty kind of biscuit smell. If you can imagine that, it's really amazing. So I've wondered why I've always had that kind of negative association with gourmands. Maybe the theory you were presenting a little while ago, John, is probably the explanation, but it has always kind of like rent my mind asunder. It's really confused me because I love food. And I'm just like, why wouldn't I like gourmands? I don't know. It just doesn't typically work. But Pistachio Gelato from Ganache is one of the few that I really, really love. I think is amazing and really well balanced.
Nice. That's very cool.
So that's the three of us, right? Or have John? Have you?
I'm yet to talk about Gourmand actually. So I think that should be our last installment. I think, right? So for my take on Gourmand, I actually am kind of excited about this one because I think there are a lot of very wonderful artisan and niche gourmands out there, but I thought, I wanted to look at something that was earlier in the trend and something that was like more affordably priced. And I remembered, because I knew there was something in there. I was like, there's something in here that was like kind of a trendsetter for this. And I remembered it. It was Hana Imori's HM. And what I liked about this one so much is this was in people will tell me I'm wrong, maybe, which is fine. I'm willing to be corrected. But this was one of the first fragrances catered to the men's audience that was a kind of sweeter gourmand, not like ridiculously sweet, but had a very full bouquet that had gourmand elements in it. So the gourmand elements are predominantly chocolate and vanilla in the base, and they're really just beautifully done here because they're part of a larger whole. And and this is a very full, you know, there's some lemon, there's some black currant, there's some like virus, jazz. So there's a lot of stuff going on, but there's these really nicely punctuated bits of, you know, really solid, rich vanilla in the base, and this nice dollop or, you know, big old chunk of chocolate in there as well, which like right now, you know, just a minute after spraying, you can just get that sort of nice, dark, but still milky chocolate note that comes through. And I really respected that. This was an early, I think this is about 25 years old now, this fragrance. Like it just hit 25. And, you know, someone took a bit of a dare, you know, to say, can we make something that predominantly men will wear that will have chocolate and vanilla in it, and yet will still operate as a kind of casual, easy to wear fragrance on a daily basis? And they were able to do it. Hana Mori really did it successfully and keep it affordable, keep it like, you know, I think it's gone up in price now, but I think it's for, you know, a decent sized bottle, you're not looking at more than like $70. So it's maybe like 65 or something. So and it's just a wonderful everyday wear. And I like this part of the gourmand where it doesn't have to be completely kooky. I love the kooky and weird gourmands and experimental gourmands, but I love the accessibility of this gourmand. It's just really amazing. And it's just a classic go-to. I don't wear this all that often, but when I do, I'm just kind of reminded of how it actually taps a little bit into what you were talking about earlier, Nicola, about, you know, there's something to be said for those kind of accessible, sweet, you know, anybody can wear, easy to wear gourmands. And I love that about this. It's a great fragrance. Yeah.
I wish sometimes I would love to be a fly on the wall in those pitch meetings where they're like, look, we want to do a man's fragrance, but we want it to smell of chocolate because you know what? Women like chocolate. And everybody going, no, that's madness.
That's right.
And somebody going, no, you know what? Let's try it.
Let's try this.
Yeah, it's brilliant. So
yeah, you know, it completely is. It totally is.
So should we do that thing that we did in the last installment where we, you know, display all of our choices again and recap it, and if we have to choose one category and one of the fragrances, try to make that tough call?
yes.
Yeah, we can certainly do that. We absolutely can.
Yeah.
Do you want to have a go at it, Nicola?
Yeah. Okay. So my green was Fathom 5 by Beaufort London. My fruity was Trey by Neil Vermeer Creations. My floral was California Reverie by Van Cleef & Arpels. Leather was Quiverninum PGO3 by Pierre Guillaume. And my gourmand was Milk Musk by Molton Brown. So if I can only keep one category, it's really hard. But I mean, leather's out, green's out straight away. So it's between fruity, floral, and gourmand for me. I think I will keep. It's hard because out of this lot, Trey is my favourite perfume. So I would keep Trey as the perfume, but as the category, I think I would keep floral.
That's
It's
fair.
it's a hard, yeah, florals are just so important to the history and the future of perfume that I couldn't hardly blame you there.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely.
How about you, John?
So to recap, for green, my choice was Monsiage Eau De Celeri, with a little passing mention of Penelligan's English Fern. For the fruity category, sorry, one second. My choice was Serge Lutens Arabi. For the leather category, that was Hermes Bellamy, or in this case, Bellamy Vetiver. The floral category was Joram Studios Elegy. And for Gourmand, Hana Mori's HM. Of the categories, that's a tough one. These are some really beloved categories. I traditionally have always had a great love of green fragrances, and so my tendency is to veer toward green. I would say that, oddly enough, that Arabi, the fragrance I mentioned, has been a pretty significant fragrance for me generally. So this would probably be the fragrance that I couldn't do without. So oddly enough, the fruity fragrance is the one that I would pick. And I would say the category that would probably be the one that I would choose to not, do without, or would be green. Yeah, for me. What about you, Adam?
Just 1 second.
Winnie, stop that.
So I'll start with the easy one. The category one is easy for me because, well, I should reintroduce with fragrances. So I had John's very own January scent project, Eider Antler, for green. I had Salted Green Mango from Stranger's Parfumery for fruity. Joe Malone's Blue Hyacinth Cologne, which I don't think is completely discontinued. I think you can still find it. By the way, should have mentioned that earlier. As my floral pick, I don't have a bottle of it, but number 84, Youth But Not Innocence by OSM for my leather, and Pistachio Gelato from Ganache Parfums for my Gourmand. So like I said, category choice is easy for me because 3 of them go out the window immediately, very quickly. And that is the Gourmand, the leather, and the fruity category. I just don't have as close associations with those as I do for greens and florals. And if I'm going to pick between those two, if you had asked me a year or 2 ago, it probably would have been green. But nowadays, I think it's going to be floral. Both from a more subjective point of view, I'm just really coming into florals lately. I'm more and more fascinated by flowers, and I'm going to be having my own garden soon. So I'm just sort of in a floral state of mind. From a more objective point of view, as objective as you can get, florals just have such an importance throughout the history of perfume that if you were to get rid of them entirely, it would wreak havoc on the medium. So that is probably my category pick. And I think for the individual, it's another difficult choice here because they all have very personal meanings for me. But putting our friendship aside, John, I do think Eider Antler is the one I would choose because it was an impactful, like, intellectual experience for me to discover it and to kind of pick it apart. Never mind the fact that I've had conversations with you that are technical about it, and I'm lucky enough to be able to have those. So no, I would say that Eider Antler is my choice for keeping because it is so many things that I like about fragrance in one. Sort of a fougere, it's a green. It kind of cheats a little bit because it's like, oh well, it's a green fragrance, but it's also kind of a fougere, and it's kind of this, kind of that. It's all over the place in that respect. So I love that about it, and that's why I would choose it over others.
That's cool.
Great.
So Nicola, can you wrap things up here by giving our viewers a little hint at our part 3 installment?
Well, I think we're looking for some viewer and listener participation to help us shape part 3, in that we want to do a kind of kooky episode. So we want to do the weird, yeah, kooky tableau.
We should all just make funny faces for the thumbnail of that video.
Yeah.
That wasn't very funny. It's just a face. Anyway.
So yeah, we want to look at weird categories that we may have sent in. So, you know, think things like smoky or most futuristic or most medieval smelling, most magical, things like that. We'd like to know what categories you would like us to look at. Please leave your ideas in the comments and we'll pick some of them hopefully. And yeah, so we're gonna try and do that in the next few weeks. And we'll probably throw some of our own in there because I really want to look at smoky because I like a bit of smoke. And yeah, some other weird categories alongside that. So yeah, please do leave us your thoughts. And as we started off by saying in part 1, this whole series was spawned from a very kind Fragrantica user, Lefranc, I think his or her name was, who suggested this as a topic for us. So if you've got any other great ideas for Fragrantica Talks episodes that you'd like us to tackle, please do leave them in the comments because we do read them, and you never know, we might be giving you a shout out in a future episode. So there we go.
Excellent.
All right. Talk soon, everyone.
Yes.
Thanks
Thank
very
you
much.
so much. Bye.
Bye.